How could one black cat on a moonlit rooftop hold the secrets to a curse that haunts the entire town? What happens when its piercing yellow eyes lock with yours, drawing you into a web of ancient fate from which there is no escape? On nights when the moon is full, a black cat appears on the rooftops, perched high above the world, silent and still. Its sleek fur glistens in the moonlight, but its eyes, those haunting, unblinking yellow eyes, are what draw you in. It watches the houses below, its gaze unyielding, as though it is waiting for something to happen. Every full moon, without fail, it returns, as though bound by some ancient, unseen force. No one knows where it comes from, nor why it chooses to appear only during the dead of night. It simply is, a dark sentinel watching over the town with a chilling, quiet authority. Those who live in the houses below have all felt it, the unsettling weight of its gaze. It's not just a cat. It's something more. Something that seems to know too much, something that watches, not in curiosity, but in expectation. Cold. Knowing. All-consuming. As though it waits for something, for someone, to cross its path, to meet its eyes and be pulled into its mysterious world. There are whispers, ancient stories passed down through generations, spoken in hushed tones, with a wary glance over the shoulder. Some say the cat is a harbinger of doom, a creature tied to a curse so old that no one can remember its origins. They say that once its eyes lock with yours, you are marked, destined to follow the path it leads you down, one from which there is no return. Others say the cat is merely an observer, a witness to the unraveling of fate, waiting patiently for the day its purpose will finally be revealed. But what truly makes it terrifying is not just the chilling tales of doom or the vague whispers that float through the air. It's the certainty that it is always watching. Watching, waiting for something to unfold, for something or someone to stumble into its path. And when that moment comes, when its eyes finally meet yours, nothing will ever be the same again. It was the night of the full moon again. The silver light spilled across the town, bathing everything in an eerie glow. All was quiet, save for the soft rustle of leaves and the occasional hoot of an owl. In the attic of a small house at the edge of town, Sarah sat at her desk, the glow of the moon seeping through the window. She was working late, her focus on the papers in front of her, but something kept tugging at the back of her mind, something she couldn't shake. Then, it happened. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw a figure on the roof. It was always the same. Every full moon, the black cat would appear, sitting motionless on the rooftop, staring down into the house. Its fur was sleek, its eyes a penetrating yellow, as though it could see into the very core of her soul. For years, Sarah had heard the stories, the legends whispered in hushed tones by the older folks in town. They spoke of the cat's curse, of how it would appear before something terrible happened, how it always knew when something was wrong. But Sarah had always dismissed the stories as superstition. Until now. She stood up from her desk, her feet moving without thought, her gaze locked on the cat. It was as if it was beckoning her, pulling her attention with an undeniable force. And then, it blinked. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. The cat's eyes seemed to pierce through the darkness, staring directly at her, as if it knew she was watching. As if it knew something she didn't. Her heart raced. She turned away, but the feeling of its gaze remained, like an invisible weight pressing down on her chest. She tried to shake it off, but the unease lingered, gnawing at her. Something was wrong. She could feel it in the pit of her stomach. The cat wasn't just watching. It was waiting. The cat's presence lingered in Sarah's mind long after she had left her attic room. She tried to push it out, to focus on the mundane tasks of the day, but it was impossible. The moment her eyes closed, all she could see was its yellow gaze, staring back at her, cold and unblinking. That night, she lay awake in bed, the moonlight filtering through the curtains and casting long shadows across the room. The clock ticked steadily, each second dragging on longer than the last. The silence was suffocating, broken only by the occasional creak of the house settling or the distant hum of the wind outside. Sarah tried to sleep, but the feeling of being watched wouldn't leave her. She couldn't escape it. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the cat's face, its eyes fixed on her, waiting. Then, at the stroke of midnight, there was a sound, a soft, almost imperceptible tapping at her window. Her heart jumped in her chest. She slowly turned her head toward the window, dread creeping into her veins. It was only the wind, she thought. But something told her otherwise. Something made her reach for the bedside lamp, the light flickering briefly before coming to life. There, on the windowsill, stood the cat. Its silhouette was framed by the light of the moon, its yellow eyes glowing, fixed on her like it had been there the entire time. Frozen, Sarah stared at it. The cat did not move. It did not blink. It simply watched. A cold shiver ran down her spine as the air in the room seemed to grow colder. Her mouth went dry. "What do you want?" she whispered, though she knew it would never answer. It stared at her for what felt like an eternity before it slowly turned and disappeared into the shadows. The tapping stopped. The room fell silent again. But Sarah knew it wasn't over. The cat had come for a reason, and whatever it wasn't good. She could feel it deep in her bones. Needed air, needed to clear her mind. But as she stepped onto the porch, her eyes instinctively went to the roof. There it was. The black cat sat, as it always did, perched on the edge of the roof, staring down at her. Its yellow eyes glowed in the dim moonlight, and Sarah felt the familiar chill run through her. This time, she didn't feel just fear. There was something else, a sense of urgency, like the cat was trying to tell her something. She couldn't explain it, but deep down, she knew she had to find out why it was watching her. "I can't keep ignoring this," she whispered to herself. With a deep breath, she stepped off the porch and began walking toward the old shed in the backyard. There was something about the shed that had always felt strange to her, old, abandoned, and filled with forgotten things. It was always the place where her curiosity led her whenever she needed answers, and tonight, she hoped it would do the same. The fog rolled in as she approached the shed, and as she opened the creaky door, she could feel the weight of the night pressing in on her. The smell of dust and old wood filled the air as she stepped inside. As her eyes adjusted to the dim light, she noticed something unusual there. On the floor was a small, worn book. It looked old, covered in dust, but the pages looked untouched. Hesitantly, she bent down and picked it up. The cover was too faded to read, but the feeling of it in her hands sent a cold shiver up her spine. She opened the book, and the first page was filled with strange symbols. It wasn't a language she recognized, but somehow, she understood the meaning behind them. The words on the page were a warning about the cat. It was no ordinary cat, it was a creature of the night, a harbinger of fate. And every time it appeared, it marked the beginning of something terrible. Sarah's heart raced as she flipped through the pages of the old book. Every page was filled with cryptic symbols, and the further she read, the more she felt the weight of the words pressing on her chest. The cat, it seemed, was not merely an observer. It was an agent of fate, a creature sent to ensure certain events unfolded. Her hands trembled as she continued to read. The book spoke of a curse, one that had been passed down through generations. It said that every full moon, the black cat would appear to someone destined to face a grave event. The cat's gaze was said to be the trigger, and once it locked eyes with its chosen, the curse would take hold. The curse was not one of death, it was far worse. It trapped the person in a cycle, forcing them to live out their worst fears, their darkest memories, until the day came when the curse claimed them entirely. "No," Sarah whispered, her voice shaking. "This can't be real." But the words in the book were clear. The curse had already started, and there was no way out. The cat had chosen her. With a sense of dread gnawing at her insides, Sarah slammed the book shut. She couldn't keep reading. The weight of the truth was too much to bear. Suddenly, she heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind her. She spun around, but the shed was empty. Yet, the air felt thick, charged with something invisible. Then, from the corner of her eye, she saw it, the shadow of the black cat, darting across the yard. That night, Sarah couldn't sleep. The cat's presence weighed heavily on her, and she could feel its eyes on her, even through the walls of her house. The shadow seemed to stretch longer, the silence deeper. It was as though the world itself had fallen into an eerie stillness, awaiting the inevitable. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, her mind racing. What if the book was right? What if the cat's gaze had already sealed her fate? There had to be a way out. There had to be something she could do to break the curse before it was too late. But as the clock ticked toward midnight, Sarah's gaze drifted to the window. And there it was, perched on the roof once again, its yellow eyes staring right at her. It wasn't just watching. It was waiting. Her heart pounded in her chest as she watched it, the same suffocating sense of dread that had gripped her earlier returning with full force. She couldn't explain it, but she could feel it, something was coming. And whatever it was, it would change everything. The cat's eyes gleamed in the moonlight, its gaze unyielding. And Sarah knew, deep down, that the moment had arrived. The curse was no longer something distant, it was here. And she had no choice but to face it. The silence in Sarah's room was suffocating. The moonlight pouring through the window illuminated the black cat sitting motionless on the roof, its eyes locked on hers. Sarah felt its gaze penetrate deep into her soul, like a chilling force pulling her into the darkness. Every muscle in her body screamed for her to look away, to escape, but her feet were frozen, her body refusing to obey. The clock on her nightstand ticked loudly, marking the seconds as they dragged by. She couldn't tear her eyes away from the cat. It was as though she was being drawn into a trance, a state where nothing else mattered, where time no longer existed. Her mind raced. The book had warned her. Once the cat locked its gaze with her, it had already begun. The curse had been activated. And she had no idea what would happen next. Was it already too late? She didn't know. But she knew one thing, the cat wasn't just watching. It was waiting. Waiting for her to make the next move. Suddenly, the air in the room grew colder. Sarah could feel the temperature drop, the chill seeping into her bones. She shivered involuntarily, her breath visible in the air as the room seemed to grow darker. The cat's eyes gleamed brighter, and the room felt smaller, suffocating. Without warning, the cat leapt from the roof and landed softly on the ground, its movement smooth and deliberate. It didn't run away. It didn't retreat into the night. It moved toward her, its eyes never leaving hers, its presence overwhelming. Sarah tried to move, to speak, but the words were lost. She was paralyzed, unable to break free from the cat's unblinking stare. The room seemed to close in around her, the walls pressing in, and then, a voice soft, like a whisper in her mind. "Come to me." The words echoed in her head, not spoken aloud, but felt deeply, as if the cat itself had planted them there. The pressure in the room increased, her heart pounding in her chest, and she knew she had no choice. She was already caught in its grip. Sarah took a tentative step forward. Her body moved of its own accord, no longer under her control. She tried to fight it, but the cat's presence was irresistible. The closer she got, the more she felt its pull, like a gravitational force drawing her in. The cat was no longer a mere creature of the night. It was something older, something far more powerful, and it was waiting for her to fulfill its purpose. Sarah could hear her own heartbeat in her ears, a rhythmic pounding that matched her steps as she approached the door. The darkness seemed to envelop her, the shadows in the corners of the room stretching like claws reaching for her. Every movement felt slow, deliberate, as if she were walking through a dream or a nightmare. When she reached the door, She hesitated. The voice in her mind urged her forward. Open it. Her hand grasped the doorknob, and with a shaky breath, she turned it. The door creaked open, revealing the same fog she had seen outside, thick and swirling. It was like stepping into another world, a world where the air itself felt wrong, where the shadows had substance. The cat was at her feet now, its body brushing against her legs as it moved forward. Its eyes were fixed on her, and Sarah felt her body obeying it like an automaton. She stepped into the fog, unable to stop herself. The door slammed shut behind her, and she was swallowed by the mist, the black cat leading her into the unknown. Her heart raced as the fog thickened around her. She couldn't see anything clearly, but she could feel the weight of the air, the oppressive silence that filled the space. The whispers grew louder in her mind, overlapping with her thoughts, urging her to keep walking. Come with me, the voice whispered again. You have already chosen. The ground beneath her feet felt unstable, like she was walking on something that was constantly shifting. She stumbled but caught herself, unable to stop the journey now. The cat was still by her side, its pace unhurried, but its presence commanding. She could feel it guiding her, as if it were leading her somewhere important, somewhere she was meant to be. The fog pressed in around Sarah, a suffocating blanket, and the further she went, the darker it became. Her footsteps were muted by the thick mist, and the eerie stillness of the night made every sound, no matter how small, seem amplified. Each breath she took was heavier than the last, the cold air seeping into her chest and leaving her shivering. The cat moved ahead of her, its sleek black form cutting through the fog like a shadow, its eyes gleaming with an unsettling brightness. Sarah's mind was a blur of confusion and fear. She tried to grasp the situation, to make sense of the curse the cat had brought upon her, but it was all too much. She could feel herself slipping into a dreamlike state, disoriented and detached from reality. She glanced behind her, but the house she had just left was gone. There was nothing familiar. The fog stretched endlessly in all directions, a void that seemed to swallow everything it touched. There was no turning back. There was only forward. The cat stopped in front of her and turned, waiting. Its eyes were fixed on her, its gaze cold and calculating. Where are you taking me? Sarah asked, her voice barely more than a whisper, but the cat did not answer. Instead, it began to walk again, its steps measured and deliberate. She had no choice but to follow. They came to a clearing in the mist, a space that felt wrong, unnatural. In the center of the clearing stood a massive, old tree. Its gnarled branches reached out like twisted hands, and the trunk seemed to pulse with some unknown energy. The tree was surrounded by a circle of stones, and within the circle, the fog swirled and thickened, as if drawn to the tree's power. The cat stopped just before the circle and sat, its eyes still locked on Sarah. Without thinking, Sarah stepped forward, drawn to the tree as if it were calling her. The moment she crossed into the circle, a wave of energy hit her, sharp and intense. She stumbled, clutching her head as a vision flooded her mind. In the vision, she saw herself standing at the edge of the fog, her eyes locked with the cat's. The cat was no longer just a creature of the night. It was something older, something more powerful, something that controlled the very fabric of fate. And she, too, was part of its design. The vision shattered, and Sarah gasped, falling to her knees. She could feel the power of the tree pulsing around her, and the whispers in her mind grew louder, more frantic. They were calling her, beckoning her to join them. She looked down at the ground, at the stones that encircled her. They were ancient, worn by time, but they were also etched with strange symbols, symbols she couldn't understand. They glowed faintly, as though alive with energy. Why? Sarah whispered. What do you want from me? The cat stood and walked toward her, its steps slow and deliberate. It stopped just in front of her, and for a moment, Sarah thought she saw something shift in its gaze, something almost human. Everything has its purpose, the cat said, its voice low, not spoken aloud, but felt deep in her mind. You are part of the cycle. You are part of what comes next. The words echoed in Sarah's mind, but they didn't make sense. She couldn't grasp them. She couldn't understand what the cat meant by the cycle, and she certainly couldn't fathom why she had been chosen. But the longer she stood there, in the circle of stones, the more she realized that it didn't matter. There was no escape. The cat, the fog, the tree, they were all part of the same twisted fate that had pulled her here. The energy around her pulsed again, stronger this time, and Sarah felt a force pushing her to her feet. She didn't want to move, didn't want to face what was about to happen, but her body obeyed. She was being led, pulled forward, deeper into the mystery of the curse that had been placed upon her. The cat circled around her, its eyes never leaving her, and for the first time, Sarah felt a shift in the air. It was subtle, like a presence had entered the clearing, something dark, something ancient, something that had been waiting for this moment. The whispers in her mind grew louder, until they became a cacophony, a chorus of voices from the past, lost souls who had walked the same path. You cannot resist it, the cat said, its voice cutting through the chaos. This is your fate. This is your destiny. The ground beneath her feet began to tremble, and the fog around her swirled violently, pulling her into the heart of the circle. The symbols on the stones glowed brighter, and Sarah could feel the energy building, rising, until it was all-consuming. She closed her eyes, unable to stop the pull, and in that moment, she understood. She had been chosen not as a victim, but as a part of something far greater, something darker. The curse was not something she could escape. It was her fate, her place in the cycle. And as the fog closed around her, she stepped forward, embracing the truth that had been revealed. Sarah stood at the center of the stone circle, her heart pounding in her chest, her body frozen in place. The fog around her had thickened to an almost tangible substance, closing in with suffocating intensity. The ancient tree behind her loomed like a guardian of some dark, forgotten secret. It felt as though the world had collapsed into this one moment, this one decision. The black cat was still at her feet, its eyes glowing with that same unyielding stare. She could feel its gaze digging into her, a presence both comforting and terrifying, urging her to accept what had already been set into motion. The whispers that had been circling in her mind now formed coherent words, not spoken aloud but felt deep in her bones. Join us. The words felt like a command. Her mind reeled as she tried to fight it, to cling to whatever sense of reality she could find, but there was no escape. There was nothing left to hold onto. The more she resisted, the heavier the air became, pressing down on her, suffocating her will to fight. Why? She whispered, her voice shaky. Why me? The cat's eyes softened for a moment, but its answer was simple, chilling. Because you are part of the cycle. You were always meant to be. Sarah felt a strange, overwhelming sense of clarity wash over her. The truth, the purpose, it was all so clear now. This wasn't just about her. It never had been. The black cat, the fog, the curse, it was all part of something much larger, something ancient. She had been chosen, not out of malice, but out of necessity. Her body moved without her consent, her feet stepping forward into the deeper shadows of the clearing. The symbols on the stones glowed brighter as she crossed the threshold, and the moment she stepped beyond them, the fog seemed to fold in on itself, swallowing everything in its path. She could hear the whispers growing louder, more desperate now. She was being pulled into something, into a deeper reality where the laws of the living world no longer applied. It was as if she were stepping into another realm, another plane of existence. The cat walked beside her, its soft paws making no sound on the misty ground, guiding her forward. You are part of the road now, it said, its voice a low hum in her mind. Like all who have walked before you. The fog thickened around them, and Sarah felt her heart beat slow. Her breath came in shallow gasps, the weight of the moment pressing down on her like an anvil. She wasn't afraid anymore. The fear had melted away, replaced by a strange acceptance. This was her fate, her role to play in the ancient cycle that governed this place. Her footsteps echoed softly, each one marking her descent into the unknown. She wasn't alone anymore. There were others, 2 others who had walked this path before her. She could feel their presence around her, their eyes watching her, judging her, but they were no longer real. They were just shadows of the past. And as Sarah reached the heart of the fog, where the ground seemed to fall away into nothingness, she realized something even more terrifying. There was no escape. There never had been. The cycle was endless, and she was now a part of it. The cat stopped in front of her, and for the first time, Sarah felt its eyes not as a threat, but as a guide. "This is your new beginning," it said, its voice almost comforting. "Embrace it." Sarah closed her eyes, letting the fog consume her completely. The whispers ceased, and the world around her faded into nothingness. There was no light, no darkness. Only the endless walk, the never-ending cycle. And Sarah walked on. The fog slowly began to recede, and the moonlight bathed the clearing in an eerie glow. The once densely packed mist that had swallowed Sarah was now a thin veil, floating like a distant memory. The tree, ancient and twisted, remained at the center, its gnarled branches reaching out as if to cradle the void in its arms. But Sarah was gone. There was no trace of her presence, no sign of the woman who had once walked the earth, full of life and possibility. In her place was only the empty space where the fog had been, where the cycle had claimed another soul. The black cat was nowhere to be seen, but its eyes, always watching, were embedded in the shadows that surrounded the clearing. The world had not stopped. It had merely shifted. In the distance, the first tendrils of fog began to curl back into the forest, creeping toward the town beyond. The whispers started again, softer now, as if the road was calling for its next victim, its next lost soul. The cycle would begin anew. It always did. And the house where Sarah had lived, was it still there? Would the next soul hear the faint scratching of claws on the roof during the full moon, or would they feel the cat's gaze piercing through their windows? Would they, too, fall into the same trap, just as Sarah had? In the days that followed, people in the town began to whisper about the strange occurrences. They spoke of a shadow that seemed to move along the rooftops, the unmistakable gaze of the black cat, and a feeling of unease that had settled over the town like a thick fog. But by then, it was too late. The curse had already marked its new victim, and the cat would return again when the time was right. The moon waxed and waned, and the seasons changed, but the cycle remained. The road, the fog, the cat, they all waited. They waited for the next person to wander too far, for the next lost soul to cross the threshold and take their place in the never-ending cycle. And the cat would be there, perched silently on the roof, its eyes gleaming in the moonlight, watching, waiting for the cycle to begin again. As the wind howled through the trees and the night grew silent once more, it was clear, the curse had not ended. It had only begun.